The moment I realized my family would always choose my brother over me wasn't during some huge argument. It wasn't after years of favoritism. It wasn't even when they emptied my college fund to save him. It happened in a crowded restaurant on my 22nd birthday. A birthday they forgot was mine. I remember standing near the entrance, holding a small gift bag I'd bought for myself on the way there. It sounds pathetic now, but I'd spent years lowering my expectations. I figured if nobody else remembered my birthday, at least I could do something nice for myself. The restaurant was packed with relatives. My parents were smiling. My aunts were laughing. My cousins were taking pictures. For one brief moment, I thought maybe they had actually planned something for me. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe this year they remembered. Then I saw the banner. Congratulations, Ryan. My stomach dropped. The dinner wasn't for me. It was for my older brother. Again, Ryan had quit another job. His third that year. Apparently, he had decided to start a business selling custom merchandise online. He hadn't sold a single product yet, but my parents were already celebrating his future success. I stood there awkwardly while relatives congratulated him. Nobody noticed me. Nobody asked why I looked upset. Nobody remembered what day it was. Halfway through dinner, my grandmother quietly leaned toward me. "Happy birthday, sweetheart." Those 4 words nearly broke me. Because she was the only person who remembered. I smiled and thanked her. Then I excused myself and locked myself in the restroom. I cried for 10 minutes. Not loud crying. Not dramatic crying. The kind where you stare into the mirror wondering why you'll never be enough. When I finally returned to the table, nobody even noticed I had been gone. That was when I stopped fighting for their attention. I stopped trying to compete with Ryan. I stopped believing that if I worked harder, achieved more, or sacrificed enough, my family would finally see me. Because Ryan didn't have to earn their love. He already had it. The rest of us were just expected to understand. Over the next few years, the gap between us grew even wider. Ryan dropped out of community college. My parents paid his bills. Ryan maxed out his credit cards. My parents paid them off. Ryan crashed his car. My parents bought him another one. Meanwhile, I worked 2 jobs while attending college full-time. Every tuition payment came out of my own pocket. Every late-night study session. Every exhausted morning. Every achievement. I earned it alone. Then I discovered something that changed everything. The college fund my grandparents had created for both grandchildren was gone. Not missing. Gone. Almost every dollar had been spent. And when I asked where the money went, my mother answered without hesitation. "We used it to help Ryan." Just like that. As if it were obvious. As if my future mattered less than his latest mistake. I remember staring at her across the kitchen table, waiting for the rest of the explanation. Waiting for her to realize how unfair it sounded. Waiting for an apology. Instead, she looked confused by my reaction. "You got scholarships," she said. "You don't need the money as much as Ryan does." Those words hit harder than any insult ever could. Because in that moment, I finally understood my place in the family. Ryan was the child they protected. I was the child they expected to survive. And years later, when their entire world came crashing down, they would discover exactly what that difference cost them. After discovering what happened to my college fund, I wish I could say I confronted my parents and everything changed. It didn't. If anything, that conversation revealed something I'd spent years refusing to accept. The favoritism wasn't accidental. It wasn't something they were unaware of. It was a choice. A choice they made over and over again. Ryan was 30 years old and still living like a teenager. Every time life demanded responsibility from him, someone else stepped in and carried the weight. Usually my parents. When he quit jobs, they paid his bills. When he missed rent payments, they covered them. When he made bad decisions, they blamed circumstances. There was always an excuse. Always a reason. Always someone else at fault. And because nobody ever forced him to face consequences, he never learned how. Meanwhile, my parents treated independence like proof I didn't need support. The more capable I became, the less they seemed to care. If I got promoted, they nodded politely before changing the subject. If Ryan managed to keep a job for 3 months, the family celebrated like he'd won an Olympic medal. At first, I tried not to let it bother me. I told myself everyone had different struggles. I told myself my parents loved us both. But love and favoritism can exist in the same house. I learned that the hard way. One Christmas, I drove 6 hours through a snowstorm just to spend the holiday with my family. I arrived exhausted but excited. I hadn't been home in almost a year. When I walked into the living room, I immediately noticed a brand new truck parked outside. A truck worth more than my annual salary at the time. Ryan's Christmas gift. My parents had bought it because he claimed reliable transportation would help him turn his life around. Meanwhile, I opened a pair of discount store gloves and a generic coffee mug. It wasn't about the money. It never was. It was about the message. Ryan's dreams were investments. Mine were expectations. As the years passed, the imbalance only grew worse. Relatives started noticing it too. A few quietly apologized to me. Others avoided discussing it entirely. Nobody wanted conflict. Nobody wanted to challenge my parents. And I was tired of being the only one who did. So eventually, I stopped. I stopped arguing. Stopped defending myself. Stopped asking why Ryan always came first. Instead, I focused on building a life far away from all of it. And for a while, that strategy worked. My business expanded. My income increased. My confidence grew. For the first time, I felt genuinely proud of what I'd accomplished. Then the phone call started. Not because my family suddenly missed me. Not because they wanted a relationship. Because Ryan had another problem. A failed investment. A new debt. A legal issue. A business idea that needed money. Every crisis somehow became family business. And every family discussion revolved around saving him. The worst part wasn't Ryan anymore. It was my parents. Because no matter how many times he failed them, they never stopped believing the next opportunity would be different. The next plan. The next dream. The next promise. They kept pouring money into a bottomless hole while ignoring the child who had quietly built a stable life without their help. Looking back now, I realized the financial collapse that eventually destroyed their retirement wasn't a surprise. It was the inevitable result of decades of choices. Choices built on guilt. Choices built on denial. Choices built on the belief that protecting Ryan was the same thing as loving him. They didn't understand that every time they rescued him, they were teaching him that someone else would always clean up the mess. And one day, the mess became too big for anyone to hide. When that day arrived, the people who had always chosen my brother over me suddenly found themselves with nowhere left to turn, except to the daughter they'd spent years overlooking. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, quietly, like a crack spreading through glass until one day the entire thing shatters. For years, I kept my distance from my family. Not out of anger anymore, out of self-preservation. I learned that every conversation left me feeling smaller than before. Every phone call somehow became about Ryan. Every family gathering reminded me where I ranked. So I stopped showing up as often. I stopped expecting invitations. I stopped waiting for birthdays, holidays, or milestones to magically become different. Instead, I buried myself in work. From the outside, my life looked successful. I owned a growing consulting business. I had a nice apartment, financial security, professional respect. But success doesn't erase loneliness. There were nights when I'd come home after a long day and realize nobody had called me in weeks. Not because they were angry, because they simply didn't think about me. That realization hurt more than any argument ever could. I wasn't hated. I was forgotten. Then came the phone call, the one that changed everything. My mother was crying so hard I could barely understand her. My father had suffered a stroke. For a moment, none of the old resentment mattered. I immediately drove back to my hometown. The 6-hour drive felt endless. Every mile filled with fear. Every thought focused on one question. Would my father be okay? Thankfully, he survived. But when I arrived at the hospital, I quickly realized his health wasn't the only emergency. My parents looked exhausted, older, defeated. The confidence they had always carried was gone. In its place was panic. That's when I learned the truth. Ryan's latest business venture had collapsed. Again. Only this time, the consequences were different. My parents had signed loan documents, co-signed debts, risked retirement savings, trusted promises that were never realistic. Now the bills were arriving. Collection notices, legal warnings, financial statements filled with numbers they couldn't possibly afford. The retirement they spent decades building was disappearing. And Ryan? Ryan was nowhere. No hospital visits. No support. No phone calls. The son they had spent their entire lives protecting had vanished the moment responsibility appeared. Watching my parents face that reality was painful. Not because they didn't make mistakes. They did. Many of them. But for the first time, I could see the cost of those mistakes written across their faces. Fear, regret, confusion. They genuinely didn't know what to do next. Meanwhile, I sat in hospital waiting rooms, helping nurses with paperwork and answering questions. Not because anyone asked me to, because there was nobody else. The strangest part was the silence. No dramatic confrontation. No screaming. No grand realization. Just silence. The kind that settles over people when the truth becomes impossible to avoid. For years, my parents had believed Ryan would eventually become the son they imagined. Now they were beginning to understand that hope wasn't a plan. And while their world slowly fell apart around them, I found myself carrying responsibilities I never should have inherited. Yet despite everything, I stayed. Because somewhere beneath all the disappointment, they were still my family. And deep down, I knew this story wasn't over yet. Looking back, I think the hardest part wasn't being overlooked. It was accepting that nothing was going to change. For years, I kept hoping my parents would wake up one day and suddenly see me. That they'd notice the sacrifices, the effort, the accomplishments. That somehow, after all this time, things would become fair. But fairness never arrived. And eventually, I stopped waiting for it. While Ryan continued chasing shortcuts, I focused on something much simpler. Building a life I could be proud of. Not to impress anyone. Not to prove anyone wrong. Just for myself. I poured my energy into my work. The same determination I'd once wasted trying to earn my family's approval became the foundation of my career. Slowly, things began to change. A promotion led to another opportunity. That opportunity became a partnership. The partnership eventually became my own consulting business. None of it happened overnight. There were setbacks, long nights, moments when I questioned whether all the effort was worth it. But unlike the promises Ryan always made, my progress was real, small, steady, earned. As the years passed, I became someone I never imagined I'd be. Financially stable, independent, confident. Not because life had been easy, because I learned how to survive when nobody was coming to rescue me. Ironically, the very thing that made me invisible in my family became my greatest strength. I learned responsibility because I had no choice. I learned discipline because nobody else would solve my problems. I learned resilience because disappointment had become familiar. Meanwhile, my contact with my family became less frequent. Not hostile, just distant. Most conversations were brief. Occasional holiday calls, birthday texts, updates that felt more like obligations than relationships. And whenever Ryan came up, which was almost always, the story never changed. A new idea, a new opportunity, a new promise that this time would be different. My parents still believed him, still invested in him, still convinced success was right around the corner. I stopped arguing years ago. People only hear the truth when they're ready for it. And my parents weren't ready. Not yet. So I focused on my own future, expanded my business, built savings, created stability. The kind of stability I'd spent my entire childhood wishing existed. For the first time in my life, I felt at peace. Not happy every day, not perfect, just peaceful. The need for validation had slowly disappeared. I no longer needed my parents to admit they were wrong. I no longer needed Ryan to fail. I no longer needed justice to move forward. Or at least that's what I told myself. Because deep down, a part of me still carried those old wounds. The forgotten birthdays. The lost college fund. The years of being second choice. I thought those chapters were behind me. I thought distance had closed the story. I was wrong. Because while I was busy building a future, my family's past decisions were quietly catching up with them. And soon, all those choices would come due at once. When they did, the people who had always depended on Ryan would find themselves depending on me. And nothing would ever be the same again. The turning point came 3 months after my father's stroke. By then, I'd spent countless hours helping my parents navigate their financial mess, meeting with attorneys, reviewing loan documents, speaking with creditors, trying to understand how decades of hard work had disappeared so quickly. The answer was always the same. Ryan. Every trail led back to him. Every debt, every unpaid balance, every broken promise. What shocked me wasn't the amount of money. It was how completely my parents had trusted him. Again and again. Even when the evidence told them not to. One afternoon, I sat across from a financial advisor while he reviewed everything. The room was painfully quiet. Finally, he closed the file and looked directly at my parents. Then he asked a simple question. Has your daughter always been the financially responsible one? My father lowered his eyes. My mother didn't answer. She couldn't. Because everyone in the room already knew the truth. For years, they treated responsibility as something ordinary when it came to me, but extraordinary when it came to Ryan. That illusion was finally gone. Over the next several months, something slowly shifted. Not in me, in them. For the first time, my parents stopped defending Ryan, stopped making excuses, stopped pretending the next promise would somehow fix everything. Reality had finally become impossible to ignore. Then came the moment that changed our family forever. Ryan came home, not to apologize, not to help, not to take responsibility. He came because he needed money. Again, we were sitting around the dining room table when he casually explained his latest business opportunity. Another investment, another plan, another dream. As he spoke, I noticed something strange. My parents weren't nodding. They weren't encouraging him. They weren't asking how they could help. They were simply listening. When Ryan finally finished, he smiled and said the words everyone expected. I just need a little support to get started. Silence filled the room. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then my father looked at him and calmly said, "No." Ryan laughed. He thought it was a joke. My father didn't. No more loans. Ryan's smile disappeared. No more debt. The room felt frozen. No more rescuing you. For the first time in his life, Ryan had nowhere to hide. No excuses. No backup plan. No parents willing to sacrifice everything for him. He looked around the room expecting someone to defend him. Nobody did. Then he looked at me. The same sister he'd spent years standing in front of. The same sister everyone overlooked. But the balance of power had changed. I didn't need to say a word. The truth was already sitting there. One child had spent years taking. The other had spent years rebuilding what was broken. As Ryan walked out the door frustrated and angry, nobody followed him. Nobody chased him. Nobody offered another chance. And in that quiet moment, I finally received something I'd waited my entire life for. Not revenge. Not an apology. Recognition. The family that had always chosen my brother over me had finally seen who was truly there when everything fell apart. Life didn't magically become perfect after that night. Families aren't repaired in a single conversation. Years of damage don't disappear because someone finally tells the truth. But things changed. Slowly. Quietly. In ways that couldn't be undone. Over the following months, my parents worked hard to rebuild what remained of their lives. The financial crisis wasn't completely over, but for the first time, they were making decisions based on reality instead of hope. There were no more risky investments. No more emergency loans. No more excuses for Ryan. Just difficult choices and honest consequences. My father recovered enough to regain some independence. My mother seemed different too. Older somehow. Not physically. Emotionally. Like someone who had finally stopped running from a truth she'd spent years avoiding. Then one afternoon, several months after Ryan's final request for money, my parents invited me to dinner. Just me. No emergencies. No paperwork. No crisis. When dessert arrived, my father slid a sealed envelope across the table. Inside was a letter. Several handwritten pages. I read every word in silence. There were no excuses. No justifications. No attempts to rewrite the past. Only acknowledgement. For the first time in my life, my parents admitted exactly what they had done. They admitted the favoritism, the unequal treatment, the opportunities they gave Ryan but denied me, the burdens they placed on me because they assumed I would survive them. Near the end of the letter, one sentence stopped me cold.